He rolled into court in an old wheelchair dressed in worn clothes and was mocked like he didn't belong. But Raymond Ellis wasn't just any man. He was a senior Justice Department inspector here to expose the people who destroyed a child's life. When a white female officer dragged him out in front of everyone, she had no idea who she was humiliating. What happens when the man everyone overlooks is the one holding the system accountable? Would you stay silent, or would you fight back even if it's been 15 years too late? If this story speaks to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's find out what really happened that day in court. The courtroom was already half full when Raymond Ellis rolled in through the rear doors. He moved slowly, not because of his age or the wheelchair, but because every step, or in his case, every turn of the wheel, meant something. He wore an old olive jacket frayed at the sleeves and a dark green cap that had clearly seen better days. To most in the room, he looked like someone who didn't belong. He settled in the front row just a few feet from the witness stand. Quiet. Still. Eyes gently scanning the room. Then came the voice, sharp and full of suspicion. "Excuse me, sir. This isn't a shelter. You might be lost." Officer Valerie Grayson, white crisp in her blue uniform, towered beside him. Her tone wasn't loud, but it had the kind of volume that cuts through a room. Her hand rested near her holster. The courtroom went a little quieter, as if waiting for the man to say something. But Raymond didn't flinch. He didn't look up, didn't argue. Instead, he opened his worn-out wallet and gently brushed his fingers over a small photograph tucked behind the ID window. The image was faded, but it still held the warmth of a smile, the face of a young boy, maybe 14, with bright eyes and a proud stance. Raymond held the picture for a breath too long. Then he tucked it back in. Valerie stood there for another moment, confused, perhaps even annoyed that her presence hadn't stirred a reaction. She turned and walked off with a small huff, but not before muttering under her breath, "Figures." Nobody paid much attention. No one stepped in. One of the bailiffs raised an eyebrow, then looked away. Raymond's eyes drifted to the judge's bench. He stayed there a second longer, then bowed his head ever so slightly, as if remembering a place he'd once stood, or a name he hadn't spoken in years. This courtroom wasn't new to him. In fact, it held the echo of something long buried, a case that was never resolved, a child whose name had never made headlines, a silence that was never questioned. But Raymond had come back for a reason, and even though no one recognized him, not yet, the wheels beneath his chair weren't the only thing he'd come to move. His story, quiet, persistent, and heavier than it looked, was just beginning. Valerie Grayson stepped toward him with a look that made no effort to hide her contempt. Her voice was sharp-clipped, designed to be overheard. "You're sitting in the wrong place, sir. That's reserved for witnesses." Raymond Ellis didn't flinch. He looked up slowly, steady, as a man who'd weathered bigger storms than this moment. "I have a right to sit here," he said quietly, his voice calm but immovable. Valerie folded her arms. "Right. This isn't a waiting room, sir. You're interrupting court business. Either move now or I'll move you myself." From where he sat in his worn-down wheelchair, Raymond's fingers rested gently on the photograph he kept tucked inside his coat pocket. He didn't raise his voice, didn't protest. He had learned a long time ago that in rooms like this, volume was often mistaken for defiance, and defiance got punished. Valerie didn't wait. With a sudden jerk, she shoved the wheelchair sideways. Raymond's body lurched, the wheels screeching against the marble floor as he was forced into the center aisle. Gasps echoed across the room. Not loud, but audible, like the breath had been knocked out of the courtroom itself. For a second, no one moved. No one said a word. Then, from the back, the small voice of a girl broke the silence. "Why are they doing that to him, Mommy?" The mother, stiff with embarrassment, placed a finger on her daughter's lips and whispered, "Shh, don't look." Judge Whitaker looked up briefly from her elevated bench. Her eyes passed over the scene without pause, as if nothing unusual had happened, then returned to the folder in front of her. She made no comment, no objection. The prosecutor, Rachel Knox, sitting at her table near the front, raised an eyebrow in passing, but her hands didn't stop moving. She kept flipping through papers as though nothing worth noting had taken place. Valerie walked over and yanked the wheelchair toward the courtroom exit. The motion was sharp, rougher than it needed to be. As he was dragged down the aisle, Raymond's hand clutched the photo inside his coat. Not out of panic, but because letting go would have been a betrayal. Of memory, of purpose, of Malik. He turned his head as they neared the doors, his eyes locked with Judge Whitaker's, and in that moment she recognized him. Her face didn't change, but her hand paused on the page. Her breath caught just briefly. It had been years, but she knew exactly who he was, and he knew she remembered. They had crossed paths once before inside these very walls. That day had ended with a decision she signed, one she knew wasn't right, but was convenient. But now the man from that buried case was here again. Not as a lawyer, not as a witness, not as anyone official, just as a man in a wheelchair. Alone. Until he wasn't. Valerie pushed open the doors with her hip, dragging him past the threshold. Raymond didn't resist. His voice stayed silent. But inside the weight of every insult, every shrug, every look that had dismissed him as nothing, they were building into something else. Not rage, not revenge, but resolve. He had let the past stay buried once, but not this time. And as the doors shut behind him, cutting him off from the courtroom, filled with silence and polite complicity, a quiet promise echoed inside him. They don't see me now, but they will. The hallway outside the courtroom was colder than it needed to be, the kind of cold that made silence feel heavier. Raymond adjusted the collar of his coat, his hands slow and deliberate as if reclaiming a small piece of dignity from the scuffed floor beneath his wheels. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. A man in a dark blue security uniform approached, limping slightly. He looked to be in his late 60s, his silver hair neatly parted, his eyes sharp despite the years. When he saw Raymond, he stopped. There was a flicker in his gaze, recognition, almost disbelief. "Raymond Ellis," the guard said, voice low. "You're DOJ, aren't you?" Raymond offered a faint nod. He didn't smile, just reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a worn leather badge case. He opened it slowly and held it up. The guard leaned in, his breath caught. "Still official," Raymond murmured. The old man blinked, then let out a breath like he had been holding it in for years. "It's been a long time. I didn't think they'd ever send anyone back for that." Raymond didn't look away. They didn't. The silence stretched between them. Then the guard spoke again, more softly this time, his eyes narrowing. "This is about that boy, isn't it, Malik Johnson?" Raymond didn't answer right away. He looked down for a moment, his fingers brushing against the edges of the badge, then closed the case and returned it to his coat. "I buried it once," he said. "Filed it, accepted it, told myself the system had spoken. But it didn't. It just silenced him." The guard stepped aside, glancing toward the security cameras above them. "Come with me." They moved quietly down the hall, Raymond rolling beside him. At a nondescript door marked "Security Personnel Only." The man swiped his ID and pushed it open. Inside was a narrow stairwell, dimly lit and rarely used. They descended without speaking. In the basement level, past a utility corridor and through a side room filled with spare chairs and unused metal detectors, they reached a heavy steel door. The guard punched in a 4-digit code and waved Raymond through. It was the surveillance room. 4 walls of monitors, some black and white, some color. Every hallway, every courtroom, every corner of the building played in silent loops. The guard pulled the blinds shut and turned to Raymond. "I'm not asking questions," he said. "But whatever you're here for, be careful. Things haven't changed much since Malik. They've just gotten better at hiding it." Raymond nodded. His tone remained quiet, but there was a new edge beneath it. "I'm not here to expose a person. I'm here to expose a pattern." He rolled toward one of the monitors, the one showing the courtroom they had just left. Valerie Grayson had returned to her post by the side wall, arms crossed, scanning the room with a smug sort of alertness. Rachel Knox continued organizing papers. Judge Whitaker hadn't moved. Raymond narrowed his eyes at the screen. "They think they pushed me out," he said. "They don't realize they just pushed me in." The guard sat beside him in an old leather swivel chair and leaned forward. "What's the play?" Raymond didn't look away from the monitor. "I watch, I wait, and when the moment comes, I don't knock." He reached into the side of his wheelchair, retrieved a small device barely larger than a USB drive, and plugged it into the terminal beside the monitor. The screen flickered. For a second, the footage looped back to earlier that morning. Valerie's hand on the wheelchair handle. The rough push. Raymond sliding into the aisle. The girl asking her mother why. He clicked pause. "Start here," he whispered. "Let them hang themselves with their own footage." The guard crossed his arms. "You always were quiet, Raymond. But I remember. When you moved, it was never just one step." Raymond didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was already calculating what came next. Inside the cramped surveillance room, under the pale flicker of fluorescent lights, Raymond placed his worn leather case beside a modest desk. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he clicked the latches open. Each metallic snap echoed like a small reckoning, as if marking the return of something long buried. From within the case, he pulled out a thick folder, its yellow cover frayed at the corners and soft from age. Handwritten across the top in bold black marker that had faded with time was a name that had never left him. Malik Johnson, 14 years old. Black, slight frame, eyes that never stopped searching for answers in a world that refused to give them. In 2009, Malik had been arrested after a scuffle at a neighborhood basketball court. But no one had asked why he had bruises on his ribs. No one wondered how a boy that thin could be accused of assaulting an armed officer. Raymond opened the file. Arrest reports, witness statements, officer of record Valerie Grayson, presiding Judge Whitaker. No forensics, no medical exam. The petition for an independent review had been dismissed without comment. Malik's interview was recorded without a guardian or legal counsel present. Everything looked official, but none of it was right. A photograph slipped loose and fell into Raymond's lap, black and white. Malik in juvenile detention. Swollen face, split lip eyes half shut. But they were not looking at the camera. They were looking past it, past the bars, past the building, straight into the soul of a system that had swallowed him whole. Raymond held the photo close to his chest and exhaled slowly. He had read this file before. Back then he had known the truth, and he had chosen silence. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from memory. "I stayed silent because I was afraid," he whispered. "Afraid of losing my job, afraid of challenging the wrong people. But that boy, he was worth more than my entire career." He flipped open an old flip phone, its casing scratched and hinges loose, and dialed a number etched into muscle memory. When the line connected, his voice shifted. Stronger. Clearer. There was no trace of the man who had been dragged from the courtroom an hour earlier. "This is Raymond Ellis, Federal Inspector Badge number 17463. I am activating a special oversight order under Section 42, Clause 121 of the Department of Justice. Grounds include evidence suppression, racial bias, and procedural misconduct in the 2009 conviction of a juvenile currently under the jurisdiction of local judicial authorities." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a composed female voice responded. "Received. You are now granted full investigative access and independent authority. Please confirm the name of the case under review." Raymond looked down at the folder again. Malik Johnson. He closed the phone and placed it back beside the file. What lay ahead would not be simple. But he had lived long enough to know that some wrongs do not rest, no matter how much time or power is used to bury them. And this time, he had not come to ask permission. The courtroom had settled into its routine. Hum voices, low papers rustling a cough or two, breaking the silence every now and then. Judge Whitaker sat high on his bench, face unreadable gavel resting like a sleeping threat. Valerie Grayson leaned back with folded arms, tapping her pen, completely unaware that the rhythm of the room was about to change. Then the side door creaked open. At first, no one turned. But then the air shifted, as if the temperature dropped a few degrees and something unspeakable walked in with quiet confidence. Raymond Ellis rolled through the threshold, no longer in his worn jacket and faded cap. Now he wore a crisp navy blue suit, his Justice Department badge pinned cleanly above his breast pocket. He looked straight ahead, chin slightly lifted as though the past hour had never happened. It took a second, then gasps started echoing through the courtroom. Valerie stood frozen, her mouth slightly ajar. Her pen dropped. She looked around, searching for someone else to react first, as if that would make it real. Judge Whitaker's eyebrows twitched. He leaned forward imperceptibly, then quickly masked his face again in judicial detachment. But his hand trembled slightly as it adjusted the microphone. Raymond did not look at them. Instead, he turned to the bench clerk and with a voice smooth as glass, asked, "Your Honor, I request to speak under Section 47 of the Federal Oversight Clause. As a federal investigator operating under the Department of Justice, I am here today not as a witness but in official capacity." A hush spread like fog across the courtroom. Judge Whitaker blinked twice. "Mr. Ellis," he began, his voice carefully level, "this is highly irregular." "Irregular," Raymond said calmly, "is watching a man be dragged out of court for sitting where the law allows him. I will proceed." Before Whitaker could respond, a woman stood up from the third row. She held up a small tablet and said, her voice shaking slightly, "I recorded what happened earlier. If the court allows, I think people should see it." Whitaker hesitated. Valerie took a step forward, whispering, "Your Honor, this is out of protocol. That footage isn't verified." But the judge didn't answer her. Maybe he didn't dare. Maybe he saw the way the gallery had shifted, how every pair of eyes was now on Raymond and that trembling tablet. The clerk dimmed the lights. The screen lit up. The video was shaky but clear. Valerie's voice rang out first, sharp and cold. "You don't belong here, old man. This isn't a soup kitchen." Then the footage showed her hands on the wheelchair, gripping it too hard. A shove. Raymond's body jolted forward, nearly hitting the aisle. There was a collective intake of breath in the courtroom. Then came a child's voice from the background, small, confused. "Mom, why are they hurting him?" That single sentence pierced the room deeper than any accusation. Valerie's face had gone pale. She turned toward the screen as if maybe she could argue with the image, shout it down, make it disappear. No one moved. No one whispered. When the video ended, the light stayed dim for a moment longer than necessary. The silence was so thick, so alive, it felt like the room was holding its breath. Raymond spoke again, quiet, but unmistakable. "Impartial justice," he said slowly, "requires eyes that do not look away and ears that do not pretend not to hear. Today I am here to make sure this courtroom learns how to do both." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Somewhere near the back, someone let out a shaky exhale. A man with a notepad slowly lowered it, forgetting to write. Even the bailiff, a man who'd served that courtroom for 20 years, looked unsure where to rest his hands. Valerie didn't speak. She couldn't. And Judge Whitaker. He cleared his throat, adjusted his robe, but for once, said nothing. Raymond didn't wait for permission. He turned his chair slightly, eyes sweeping across the faces that once ignored him, now watching him with a kind of reverence or perhaps shame. And as he paused there, letting the weight of the moment settle, no one dared interrupt. Not because of the badge, but because of the silence. A silence that felt louder than any gavel. And for the first time that day, the courtroom knew this was no longer their ground. It was his. When Raymond Ellis returned to the courtroom, it felt like the air had changed. No words were spoken, but every person in the room sensed it. He no longer looked like the frail man in a wheelchair who had been mocked and shoved hours earlier. In a sharp navy suit with a Department of Justice badge clipped firmly to his chest, he stood like a wall that had refused to fall. The bailiff blinked. The judge adjusted his glasses, and Officer Valerie Grayson stared at him, her jaw tight, clearly realizing that whatever power she had assumed was gone. Raymond didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone made the silence louder than any shout. "I'd like to speak under federal observation privilege," he said quietly, yet with unmistakable weight. The judge hesitated, eyes narrowing for a moment, as if searching for control in a room that had already turned against him. He nodded once. Just like that, the floor belonged to Raymond. Raymond stepped forward, slowly holding an envelope in one hand. His other hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. "This morning," he began, "I was dragged across this courtroom floor for sitting quietly in the wrong chair. I did not resist. I did not raise my voice, and yet I was treated like someone unworthy of basic human respect." He paused and then continued. "If this is how a federal officer in plain clothes is handled, I want you to imagine how a child fares in the same hands." From the envelope, he pulled out a faded photograph and held it up. It showed a 14-year-old boy, one side of his face bruised and swollen lips, cracked eyes empty. "This is Malik Johnson," he said softly. In 2009, he was arrested by Officer Valerie Grayson. That same year, he was tried and sentenced in this courtroom. Judge Whitaker presided. There were no cameras, no press, no one looking. A ripple of discomfort spread across the room. This is Malik's intake photo. And these are the medical reports that were never submitted. This, he added, laying another paper down, is the forensic request that was filed but never processed. And this here, he said, holding up the last sheet, is the original arrest report. What Officer Grayson submitted later was not this. Valerie stood up suddenly, her voice sharp. I followed proper direction. I was told to document what I saw. Raymond turned to her calmly. And did you see a scared teenager as a threat? Did the directive instruct you to withhold medical care for over 12 hours? Did it also say to report him as aggressive when the witnesses said otherwise? She didn't respond. You see, Raymond said procedure is not an excuse for dehumanization. It never has been. From the back row, a woman stood. Her voice cracked, trembling but clear. Malik was my son. The entire courtroom turned. Her hands were clenched at her sides, as if holding in years of silence. He was a sweet boy. He loved drawing. He wanted to be a teacher. And we begged someone to look at this case again. We begged. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but no one listened. Raymond placed the final file down and looked to the judge. I met you once, Judge Whitaker. Briefly. 15 years ago. I was assigned from the DOJ after someone anonymously flagged this case. But the meeting lasted 10 minutes. You told me there was nothing unusual. You told me not to stir the waters. He exhaled slowly. I let it go. And I have regretted it ever since. He turned to the gallery, his voice now carrying the weight of a decade and a half. Every time I opened my wallet, I saw this boy's face. And every time I told myself, not now, not yet. Maybe someone else will do it. Maybe the world has already forgotten. A beat of silence passed. Well, I haven't. He gestured to the screen as images of Malik appeared. His injuries, his frightened eyes, his file stamped with red letters. Case closed. Dignity, Raymond said, is not something you earn with a title or lose because you are poor. Dignity is what should be given to every person who walks into this building seeking fairness. And yet, in this room, it has been treated like an inconvenience. Valerie looked down at her hands, her face pale. From somewhere in the jury box, someone whispered, "This is too much." A woman in the gallery wiped tears from her eyes. A man took off his cap and held it against his chest. Raymond nodded toward Malik's mother. She sat outside this courthouse for weeks, holding a sign. And I passed her every day. I didn't stop. I didn't speak. I was too afraid of shaking the peace I had built for myself. He paused again. I was afraid of the same silence that surrounded Malik. Then, looking directly at the judge, he said, "But silence is no longer an option." He pulled out one final document. "I'm invoking the Civil Rights Emergency Review Clause. Effective immediately, this court is under federal scrutiny for the handling of the Malik Johnson case." A gasp echoed across the room. Valerie looked over at the judge as if pleading for support. But Judge Whitaker sat still, his hands locked together, his gaze downcast. Raymond turned back to the room. This is not about revenge. This is not about shame. This is about responsibility. For the child who didn't get to grow up. For the mother who never stopped waiting. For the officers who served with honor and watched their work be tainted by others. He lifted his eyes to the ceiling. And for the soul of this courtroom, no one applauded. No one moved. They just listened. And finally, after all those years, so did the walls. As Raymond stood steady in the courtroom, his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. His presence alone held the room in an eerie hush. Then, slowly and deliberately, he turned his gaze toward the bench and pointed at Judge Whitaker. "You watched them drag me across this room," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "You heard the girl ask her mother why. You saw it, and yet you said nothing. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably. The courtroom was so still, even the shuffle of paper seemed loud. She adjusted her robe, straightened in her chair, then cleared her throat. "I did not intervene because I was adhering to protocol," she said. "Judges are not to interfere in matters of courtroom security unless—" Raymond shook his head. "Security. That wasn't security. That was humiliation. You saw a man treated like an object and let it happen. And this isn't the first time, is it?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Raymond took a step forward, hands clasped behind his back. "In 2009, you denied a motion for post-conviction relief without review. That motion included suppressed forensic evidence, conflicting witness statements, and signs of excessive force used on a child. A 14-year-old boy. You didn't even open the file. I follow the law, she replied stiffly. The court cannot act on emotion. No, Raymond said. But you're not just a judge. You're a human being. And today that silence cost you more than your credibility. Rachel Knox, the assistant district attorney, shifted in her seat. Her eyes darted between Raymond and the bench. When Raymond turned to face her, she flinched not from fear, but from something deeper. Guilt. You saw it too, Raymond said. You've read the same files. You saw the bruises on that boy's chest. You knew the report had been altered. You knew the woman who arrested him, Valerie, was the same one who dragged me across this courtroom. And you didn't speak. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought you were just a nobody. There was no venom in her tone, just shame. A murmur passed through the gallery. The mother of Malik, her eyes swollen with tears, whispered to someone beside her. 15 years. 15 years we begged for someone to listen. Then, like a slow wave, a sense of reckoning swept through the room. A representative from the Department of Justice stepped forward, reading a short statement into the record. In light of today's revelations, and upon further review of past case conduct, Judge Sylvia Whitaker is hereby placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full federal investigation into allegations of judicial misconduct, racial bias, and obstruction of justice. Whitaker's eyes widened. You can't do this. I've served this court for over 3 decades. The DOJ agent remained firm. You are not being dismissed. You are being held accountable. The judge sat back, stunned. Slowly, she gathered her papers, her movements mechanical. There was no applause, no shouts, only silence. A heavy silence. The kind that comes when a truth too long buried has finally been spoken aloud. As she descended from the bench, her robe seeming heavier than ever, her eyes briefly met Raymond's. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply watched her go. Rachel didn't speak another word. She stood, walked out quietly, and never once looked back. For the first time, Valerie looked truly alone. Her posture, once rigid with authority, now sagged under the weight of exposure. And Raymond? He sat back down this time, not as a man being judged, but as the man who had forced the system to look in the mirror. Outside news cameras had gathered. But inside, the people weren't watching for spectacle. They were watching for change, and it had begun. Valerie Grayson stood at the edge of the courtroom, her hands trembling ever so slightly. The command had come swiftly and clearly from the DOJ agent. She was to remove her badge and her firearm immediately. There was no ceremony, no formality, just the quiet weight of accountability descending on her shoulders. She looked around almost in disbelief, as though she expected someone to speak in her defense. But the courtroom that had once echoed with her authority was now a place of silence. Even the marble walls seemed to hold their breath. Her voice cracked as she tried to defend herself. I didn't know who he was. Raymond Ellis didn't stand up. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her with that same calm that had unsettled everyone since the moment he walked back into the courtroom. That's the problem, he said. You thought someone who looked like me could never be anyone. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Valerie's hands shook as she unfastened her holster. Her badge clinked against the wood of the clerk's table. The sound was oddly loud in the stillness. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her eyes, once sharp with judgment, were now searching for a place to hide from the truth. No one clapped. No one cheered. This wasn't a moment for celebration. It was something colder. Something quieter. A reckoning that did not need noise to feel final. She turned toward the gallery, perhaps hoping for a sympathetic glance, a nod, a gesture to anchor her. There was none. Even those who might once have agreed with her methods now looked away. Her former certainty had become her sentence. As she was escorted from the room, her footsteps stiff, almost robotic. A voice broke through the silence. It was a woman sitting near the back. Her voice was low but firm, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than anyone else. Now I believe silence is a sin. The room remained still, but the weight of those words rippled through the air. For years, people had looked the other way. For years, Valerie's actions had been tolerated, even praised. But now, stripped of her badge and the false armor it had provided, she stood exposed. Not just as a woman who had acted wrongly, but as part of something far more broken. Raymond did not smile. He did not rise to follow. He sat quietly, his hands folded, the photograph of Malik resting gently in his lap. The child's mother wiped her cheeks, but she did not look triumphant. Her expression carried the grief of years lost, of a name that had been buried beneath silence. And still she nodded once, as if acknowledging that at least finally someone had spoken out loud what they had always known. Outside, the world would begin to talk. There would be questions, articles, outrage. But inside that courtroom, no voices rose. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of history, full of reckoning, full of the weight that justice sometimes carries when it arrives late, but unmistakably. And as the courtroom doors closed behind Valerie, that sound barely audible was the last thing she heard. It wasn't a slam. It was the soft click of a system finally deciding it had seen enough. Raymond Ellis did not raise his voice. He never had to. That was the part that lingered with people long after the facts had been laid bare, after the courtroom had shifted from denial to revelation. He stood there at the center, not demanding applause, not savoring vindication. Just still. He looked around the room, not at the officials or the faces that had once judged him, but at the people. Ordinary men and women, teachers, clerks, students, a janitor still in uniform. People who had come expecting a routine hearing and found themselves instead at the edge of something much deeper. I didn't come here to ruin anyone's career. Raymond began, his voice low, steady. I came to end the silence. There was no podium, no script. Just a man who had carried a photograph in his pocket for 15 years. A boy's face, bruised but brave, looking back at the world that refused to see him. I stood by once, he continued, when I should have spoken. When a child named Malik needed someone to tell the truth, and I told myself it wasn't my place, that it was too risky, that I could do more good by surviving inside the system than by challenging it. I was wrong. The room was so quiet you could hear a foot shift on the wooden floor. No coughs, no phones, just listening. Listening like it mattered, because this time it did. I thought silence was strength, he said, but it's a mask, a shield for cowards, and I wore it. At that moment, someone stirred in the gallery. A young man, maybe in his late 20s. Clean suit, frayed tie. He had sat near the back the entire time, scribbling notes no one would read. But now he stood. It was Marcus, the junior attorney assigned to the case. The one who had been silent when Valerie dragged Raymond out of the courtroom. The one who hadn't dared meet his eyes when the tape played. But something had shifted. I used to think staying quiet was wise. Marcus said, his voice just loud enough to carry, that if you waited long enough, truth would speak for itself, but it doesn't. People have to speak it. And silence? Silence is just cowardice in a clean suit. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. One by one, others began to stand. A woman who worked at the DMV. A man in a postal uniform. An older teacher holding her cane tightly. They stood, not because they were told to, not because they were instructed by some order of the court, but because something in them rose some part that had been quiet too long. A man whispered from the third row, I won't be silent again. It wasn't a pledge, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Raymond didn't thank them. He didn't bask in it. He just nodded slightly, almost to himself, as though Malik was sitting there too, and maybe in some way he was. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving his title. It wasn't about what they had done to him. It was about what had been lost when no one spoke, and what might now be found when someone finally did. That day in that courtroom, no laws were passed, no great political reforms announced. But something sacred happened, not with a bang, but with the quiet weight of realization settling into the bones of everyday people. Raymond stepped away from the center. He didn't need to say more. The silence he came to break had already been broken. And now something else was beginning. Not a speech, not a verdict, but something far more lasting. A memory, a reminder, a living, breathing testament to what dignity sounds like when it finally decides to speak. Raymond stepped out into the daylight, not as a man who had won something, but as someone who had finished what needed to be done. The courthouse loomed behind him, gray and quiet, its windows catching the late afternoon sun. He didn't look back. Some endings are quieter when you let them be. The sidewalk was mostly empty. People had already dispersed their conversations, trailing behind like the scent of something they'd never forget. But just before Raymond reached the curb, a voice, small and certain, called out behind him. "Sir, wait!" He turned. It was the little girl from earlier. The one who had asked her mother why the man in the wheelchair was treated so badly. Her name tag from a school field trip was still pinned to her shirt. Layla. She ran up a bit out of breath, her backpack bouncing behind her. Her eyes were serious in a way children's eyes aren't supposed to be, but sometimes are. "I want to be like you," she said, looking up at him not with awe, but with something gentler, a kind of decision. Raymond knelt slowly, feeling the weight in his knees that had come with age and memory. He didn't smile right away. He took a moment as if her words needed space before being answered. "You don't need to be like me," he said softly. "You just need to hold on to what makes you kind. Hold it tight, even when the world tells you to let go." She looked confused for a second. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn metal badge. Not the DOJ one. This one was older. It had no shine, just the faded emblem of his first year in public service. He pressed it into her palm. "This isn't for power," he said. "It's to remind you. You don't need permission to do the right thing." She nodded, her fingers closing around it like it was something more than a token, like it was a key. A few yards away, Clarence stood near the courthouse steps. The old security guard hadn't followed the others inside when the crowd left. He stood there in his uniform, hand raised in a slow, quiet salute. Not for the badge, not for the job, for the man. Raymond met his gaze and nodded once. That was enough. There were no reporters outside, no interviews, no statements to the press. But later that evening, a court clerk named Janine would write a journal entry she never meant to share. She wrote it with the last light of the day falling through her kitchen window. She wrote, "Today justice didn't yell. It didn't throw fists or make demands, but it made everyone in that courtroom hold their breath. It made us remember what it feels like to see someone stand without raising their voice and somehow be louder than everyone else in the room. And somewhere in a city that often forgot its own truths, that quiet lingered. Not because it was over, but because something new had begun. Not a speech, not a verdict, but the sound of one man refusing to stay silent and the echo of others finally listening. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on what it means to stand for dignity even when the world tells you to stay silent. Raymond did not raise his voice or seek revenge. He simply showed up with the truth and reminded us that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality. It is complicity. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we believe in sharing voices that often go unheard. Stories that challenge the system, uplift humanity, and remind us of who we are at our core. If you believe these stories matter, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit that subscribe button to follow along as we continue telling stories that speak to the heart. Your support means more than you know. Every click, every share, every comment helps our team keep going. It allows us to bring more truth, more hope, and more justice into the world. This is not just another story. It is a reminder. And together we are building something that does not fade when the screen goes dark. Welcome to Mr. Mac's Stories, where silence ends and truth begins.